Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was a vast empire that spanned most of northern Eurasia from its proclamation in November 1721 until the proclamation of the Russian Republic in September 1917. At its height in the late 19th century, it covered about 22,800,000 square kilometers, 8,800,000 square miles, roughly one-sixth of the world's landmass, making it the third largest empire in history, behind only the British and Mongol empires. It also held colonies in North America between 1799 and 1867. The empire's 1897 census, the only one it conducted, found a population of 125.6 million with considerable ethnic, linguistic, religious, and socio-economic diversity. The rise of the Russian Empire coincided with the decline of neighboring rival powers, the Swedish Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Khaja Iran, the Ottoman Empire, and Qing China. From the 10th to 17th centuries, the Russians had been ruled by a noble class known as the boyars, above whom was an absolute monarch titled the Tsar. The groundwork of the Russian Empire was laid by Ivan III, r. 1462–1505, who greatly expanded his domain, established a centralized Russian national state, and secured independence against the Tatars. His grandson, Ivan IV, r. 1533–1584, became in 1547 the first Russian monarch to be crowned Tsar of all Russia. Between 1550 and 1700, the Russian state grew by an average of 35,000 square kilometers, 14,000 square miles, per year. Major events during this period include the transition from the Rurik to the Romanov dynasties, the conquest of Siberia, and the reign of Peter the Great, r. 1682–1725. Peter transformed the Tsardom into an empire, and fought numerous wars that turned a vast realm into a major European power. He moved the Russian capital from Moscow to the new model city of St. Petersburg, which marked the birth of the imperial era, and led a cultural revolution that introduced a modern, scientific, rationalist, and Western-oriented system. Catherine the Great, r. 1762–1796, presided over further expansion of the Russian state by conquest, colonization, and diplomacy, while continuing Peter's policy of modernization towards a Western model. Alexander I, r. 1801–1825, helped defeat the militaristic ambitions of Napoleon and subsequently constituted the Holy Alliance, which aimed to restrain the rise of secularism and liberalism across Europe. Russia further expanded to the west, south, and east, strengthening its position as a European power. Its victories in the Russo-Turkish wars were later checked by defeat in the Crimean War, 1853–1856, leading to a period of reform and intensified expansion. Into Central Asia, Alexander II, r. 1855–1881, initiated numerous reforms, most notably the 1861 emancipation of all 23 million serfs. From 1721 until 1762, the Russian Empire was ruled by the House of Romanov, its matrilineal branch of patrilineal German descent, the House of Holstein-Gottorp-Romanov, ruled from 1762 until 1917. By the start of the 19th century, Russian territory extended from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Black Sea in the south, and from the Baltic Sea in the west to Alaska, Hawaii, and California in the east. By the end of the 19th century, Russia had expanded its control over the Caucasus, most of Central Asia and parts of Northeast Asia. Notwithstanding its extensive territorial gains and great power status, the empire entered the 20th century in a perilous state. A devastating famine in 1891 to 1892 killed hundreds of thousands and led to popular discontent. As the last remaining absolute monarchy in Europe, the empire saw rapid political radicalization and the growing popularity of revolutionary ideas such as communism. After the 1905 revolution, Nicholas II authorized the creation of a national parliament, the State Duma, although he still retained absolute political power. When Russia entered the First World War on the side of the Allies, it suffered a series of defeats that further galvanized the population against the emperor. In 1917, Mass unrest among the population and mutinies in the army culminated in the February Revolution, which led to the abdication of Nicholas II, the formation of the Russian Provisional Government, and the proclamation of the First Russian Republic. Political dysfunction, continued involvement in the widely unpopular war, and widespread food shortages resulted in mass demonstrations against the government in July. The Republic was overthrown in the October Revolution by the Bolsheviks, who proclaimed the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic and whose Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended Russia's involvement in the war, but who nevertheless were opposed by various factions known collectively as the Whites. During the resulting Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks conducted the Red Terror. After emerging victorious in 1923, they established the Soviet Union across most of the Russian territory. It would be one of 4 continental empires to collapse after World War I, along with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. History. The foundations of a Russian national state were laid in the late 15th century during the reign of Ivan III. By the early 16th century, all of the semi-independent and petty princedoms in Russia had been unified with Moscow. During the reign of Ivan IV, the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan were conquered by Russia in the mid-16th century, leading to the development of an increasingly multinational state. Population. Much of Russia's expansion occurred in the 17th century, culminating in the first Russian colonization of the Pacific, the Russo-Polish War, 1654–1667, which led to the incorporation of left bank Ukraine, and the Russian conquest of Siberia. Poland was partitioned by its 3 neighbors in 1772–1815, with much of its land and population being taken under Russian rule. Most of the empire's growth in the 19th century came from gaining territory in Central and Eastern Asia south of Siberia. By 1795, after the partitions of Poland, Russia became the most populous state in Europe, ahead of France. Background. The foundations of the Russian Empire was laid during Peter I's reforms, which significantly altered Russia's political and social structure, and as a result of the Great Northern War which strengthened Russia's standing on the world stage. Internal transformations and military victories contributed to the transformation of Russia into a great power, playing a major role in European politics. On the day of the announcement of the Treaty of Nystad, the 2nd of November 1721, the governing Senate and Synod invested the Tsar with the titles of Pater Patriae and Imperator of all Russia. The adoption of the latter title by Peter I is usually seen as the beginning of the imperial period of Russia. Following the reforms, the governance of Russia by an absolute monarch was enshrined. The military regulations made a note of the autocratic nature of the regime. During the reign of Peter I, the last vestiges of the independence of the boyars were lost. He transformed them into the new nobility, who were obedient nobles that served the state for the rest of their lives. He also introduced the table of ranks and equated the votchina with an estate. Russia's modern fleet was built by Peter the Great, along with an army that was reformed in the manner of European style and educational institutions, the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences. Civil lettering was adopted during Peter I's reign, and the first Russian newspaper, Vedomosti, was published. Peter I promoted the advancement of science, particularly geography and geology, trade, and industry, including shipbuilding, as well as the growth of the Russian educational system. Every 10th Russian acquired an education during Peter I's reign, when there were 15 million people in the country. The city of St. Petersburg, which was built in 1703 on territory along the Baltic coast that had been conquered during the Great Northern War, served as the state's capital. This concept of the triune Russian people, composed of the Great Russians, the Little Russians, and the White Russians, was introduced during the reign of Peter I, and it was associated with the name of Archimandrite Zacharias Kopystensky, 1621, the Archimandrite of the Kiev-Peshchsk Lavra. Afterwards, the concept was developed in the writings of an associate of Peter I, Archbishop Professor Theophan Prokopovich. Several of Peter I's associates are well known, including François Lefort, Boris Sheremetev, Alexander Menshikov, Jacob Bruce, Mikhail Golitsyn, Anakita Riepnen, and Alexei Kellin. During Peter's reign, the obligation of the nobility to serve was reinforced, and serf labor played a significant role in the growth of the industry. Therefore, Peter's objectives required the preservation of antiquated traditions. The volume of the country's international trade turnover increased as a result of Peter I's industrial reforms. However, imports of goods overtook exports, strengthening the role of foreigners in Russian trade, particularly the British domination. 18th century, Peter the Great, 1682–1725. Peter I, r. 1682–1725, also known as Peter the Great, played a major role in introducing the European state system into Russia. While the empire's vast lands had a population of 14 million, grain yields trailed behind those in the west. Nearly the entire population was devoted to agriculture, with only a small percentage living in towns. The class of kolleps, whose status was close to that of slaves, remained a major institution in Russia until 1723, when Peter converted household kolleps into house serfs, thus counting them for poll taxation. Russian agricultural kolleps had been formally converted into serfs earlier in 1679. They were largely tied to the land, in a feudal sense, until the late 19th century. Peter's first military efforts were directed against the Ottoman Empire. His attention then turned to the north. Russia lacked a secure northern seaport, except at Archangel on the White Sea, where the harbor was frozen for 9 months a year. Access to the Baltic Sea was blocked by Sweden, whose territory enclosed it on 3 sides. Peter's ambitions for window to the sea led him, in 1699, to make a secret alliance with Saxony, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Denmark-Norway against Sweden. They conducted the Great Northern War, which ended in 1721 when an exhausted Sweden asked for peace with Russia. As a result, Peter acquired 4 provinces situated south and east of the Gulf of Finland, securing access to the sea. There he built Russia's new capital, St. Petersburg, on the Neva River, to replace Moscow, which had long been Russia's cultural center. This relocation expressed his intent to adopt European elements for his empire. Many of the government and other major buildings were designed under Italianate influence. In 1722, he turned his aspirations toward increasing Russian influence in the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea at the expense of the weakened Safavid Persians. He made Astrakhan the center of military efforts against Persia, and waged the first full-scale war against them in 1722–23. Peter the Great temporarily annexed several areas of Iran to Russia, which after the death of Peter were returned in the 1732 Treaty of Resht and 1735 Treaty of Ganja as a deal to oppose the Ottomans. Peter reorganized his government based on the latest political models of the time, molding Russia into an absolutist state. He replaced the old Boyar Duma, Council of Nobles, with a 9-member Senate, in effect a Supreme Council of State. The countryside was divided into new provinces and districts. Peter told the Senate that its mission was to collect taxes, and tax revenues tripled over the course of his reign. Meanwhile, all vestiges of local self-government were removed. Peter continued and intensified his predecessor's requirement of state service from all nobles, in the table of ranks. As part of Peter's reorganization, he also enacted a church reform. The Russian Orthodox Church was partially incorporated into the country's administrative structure, in effect making it a tool of the state. Peter abolished the Patriarchate and replaced it with a collective body, the Most Holy Synod, which was led by a government official. Peter died in 1725, leaving an unsettled succession. After a short reign by his widow, Catherine I, the crown passed to Empress Anna. She slowed the reforms and led a successful war against the Ottoman Empire. This resulted in a significant weakening of the Crimean Khanate, an Ottoman vassal and long-term Russian adversary. The discontent over the dominant positions of Baltic Germans in Russian politics resulted in Peter I's daughter Elizabeth being put on the Russian throne. Elizabeth supported the arts, architecture, and the sciences, for example, the founding of Moscow University. but she did not carry out significant structural reforms. Her reign, which lasted nearly 20 years, is also known for Russia's involvement in the 7 Years' War, where it was successful militarily, but gained little politically. Catherine the Great, 1762–1796. Catherine the Great was a German princess who married Peter III, the German heir to the Russian crown. After the death of Empress Elizabeth, Catherine came to power after she effected a coup d'état against her very unpopular husband. She contributed to the resurgence of the Russian nobility that began after the death of Peter the Great, abolishing state service and granting them control of most state functions in the provinces. She also removed the beard tax instituted by Peter the Great. Catherine extended Russian political control over the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, supporting the Targowica Confederation. However, the cost of these campaigns further burdened the already oppressive social system, under which serfs were required to spend almost all of their time laboring on their owner's land. A major peasant uprising took place in 1773, after Catherine legalized the selling of serfs separate from land. Inspired by a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev and proclaiming, "Hang all the landlords," the rebels threatened to take Moscow before they were ruthlessly suppressed. Instead of imposing the traditional punishment of drawing and quartering, Catherine issued secret instructions that the executioners should execute death sentences quickly and with minimal suffering, as part of her effort to introduce compassion into the law. She furthered these efforts by ordering the public trial of Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova, a high-ranking noblewoman, on charges of torturing and murdering serfs. Whilst these gestures garnered Catherine much positive attention from Europe during the Enlightenment, the spectre of revolution and disorder continued to haunt her and her successors. Indeed, her son Paul introduced a number of increasingly erratic decrees in his short reign aimed directly against the spread of French culture in response to their revolution. In order to ensure the continued support of the nobility, which was essential to her reign, Catherine was obliged to strengthen their authority and power at the expense of the serfs and other lower classes. Nevertheless, Catherine realized that serfdom must eventually be ended, going so far in her nakaz instruction to say that serfs were just as good as we are, a comment received with disgust by the nobility. Catherine advanced Russia's southern and western frontiers, successfully waging war against the Ottoman Empire for territory near the Black Sea, and incorporating territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the partitions of Poland, alongside Austria and Prussia. As part of the Treaty of Georgievsk, signed with the Georgian Kingdom of Kartli-Kakheti, and her own political aspirations, Catherine waged a new war against Persia in 1796 after they had invaded eastern Georgia. Upon achieving victory, she established Russian rule over it and expelled the newly established Persian garrisons in the Caucasus. Catherine's expansionist policy caused Russia to develop into a major European power, as did the Enlightenment era and the Golden Age in Russia. But after Catherine died in 1796, she was succeeded by her son, Paul. He brought Russia into a major coalition war against the new revolutionary French Republic in 1798. Russian commander Field Marshal Suvorov led the Italian and Swiss expedition. He inflicted a series of defeats on the French. In particular, the Battle of the Trebia in 1799. Nicholas II, also known as Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov, was the final emperor of Russia, King of Congress Poland, and Grand Duke of Finland. His reign started on 1 November 1894 and ended with his abdication on 15 March 1917. Born on 18 May 1868 at Alexander Palace, Tsarskoye Selo, Russian Empire, he was the eldest son and successor of Alexander Alexandrovich, later known as Alexander III of Russia, and his wife Maria Fyodorovna, formerly Dagmar of Denmark. During his rule, Nicholas II supported the economic and political reforms proposed by his prime ministers, Sergei Witte and Pyotr Stolypin. He favored modernization through foreign loans and strong ties with France, but was reluctant to give significant roles to the new parliament, the Duma. He signed the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 to counter Germany's influence in the Middle East, ending the Great Game between Russia and the British Empire. However, his reign was marked by criticism for the government's suppression of political dissent and perceived failures or inaction during events like the Kodinka tragedy, anti-Jewish pogroms, Bloody Sunday, 1905, and the violent suppression of the 1905 Russian Revolution. The Russo-Japanese War, which resulted in the destruction of the Russian Baltic fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, further eroded his popularity. By March 1917, public support for Nicholas II had dwindled, leading to his forced abdication and the end of the 304-year rule of the Romanov dynasty in Russia, 1613 to 1917. Nicholas II was deeply devoted to his wife, Alexandra, whom he married on 26 November 1894. They had 5 children, Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Cesarevich Alexei. The Russian Imperial Romanov family was executed by who were believed to be drunken Bolshevik revolutionaries under Yakov Yurovsky, as ordered by the Ural Regional Soviet in Yekaterinburg on the night of the 16th to the 17th of July 1918. This marked the end of the Russian Empire and Imperial Russia. State budget. Russia was in a continuous state of financial crisis. While revenue rose from 9 million rubles in 1724 to 40 million in 1794, expenses grew more rapidly, reaching 49 million in 1794. The budget allocated 46% to the military, 20% to government economic activities, 12% to administration, and 9% for the imperial court in St. Petersburg. The deficit required borrowing, primarily from bankers in Amsterdam. 5% of the budget was allocated to debt payments. Paper money was issued to pay for expensive wars, thus causing inflation. As a result of its spending, Russia developed a large and well-equipped army, a very large and complex bureaucracy, and a court that rivaled those of Versailles and London. But the government was living far beyond its means, and 18th-century Russia remained a poor, backward, overwhelmingly agricultural, and illiterate country. First half of the 19th century. In 1801, over 4 years after Paul became the Emperor of Russia, he was killed in St. Michael's Castle in a coup. Paul was succeeded by his 23-year-old son, Alexander. Russia was in a state of war with the French Republic under the leadership of the Corsica-born first consul Napoleon Bonaparte. After he became the emperor, Napoleon defeated Russia at Austerlitz in 1805, Ely and Friedland in 1807. After Alexander was defeated in Friedland, he agreed to negotiate and sued for peace with France. The treaties of Tilsit led to the Franco-Russian alliance against the coalition and joined the continental system. By 1812, Russia had occupied many territories in Eastern Europe, holding some of eastern Galicia from Austria and Bessarabia from the Ottoman Empire. From northern Europe, it had gained Finland from the war against a weakened Sweden. It also gained some territory in the Caucasus. Following a dispute with Emperor Alexander I, in 1812, Napoleon launched an invasion of Russia. It was catastrophic for France, whose army was decimated during the Russian winter. Although Napoleon's Grande Armée reached Moscow, the Russians' scorched earth strategy prevented the invaders from living off the country. In the harsh and bitter winter, thousands of French troops were ambushed and killed by peasant guerrilla fighters. As Napoleon's forces retreated, Russian troops pursued them into Central and Western Europe and to the gates of Paris. After Russia and its allies defeated Napoleon, Alexander became known as the Savior of Europe. He presided over the redrawing of the map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna, 1815, which ultimately made Alexander the monarch of Congress Poland. The Holy Alliance was proclaimed, linking the monarchist great powers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Although the Russian Empire played a leading political role in the next century, thanks to its role in defeating Napoleonic France, its retention of serfdom precluded economic progress to any significant degree. As Western European economic growth accelerated during the Industrial Revolution, Russia began to lag ever farther behind, creating new weaknesses for the empire seeking to play a role as a great power. Russia's status as a great power concealed the inefficiency of its government, the isolation of its people, and its economic and social backwardness. Following the defeat of Napoleon, Alexander I had been ready to discuss constitutional reforms, but though a few were introduced, no major changes were attempted. The liberal Alexander I was replaced by his younger brother Nicholas I, 1825–1855, who at the beginning of his reign was confronted with an uprising. The background of this revolt lay in the Napoleonic Wars, when a number of well-educated Russian officers traveled in Europe in the course of military campaigns, where their exposure to the liberalism of Western Europe encouraged them to seek change on their return to autocratic Russia. The result was the Decembrist Revolt, December 1825, which was the work of a small circle of liberal nobles and army officers who wanted to install Nicholas' brother Constantine as a constitutional monarch. The revolt was easily crushed, but it caused Nicholas to turn away from the modernization program begun by Peter the Great and champion the doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. In order to repress further revolts, censorship was intensified, including the constant surveillance of schools and universities. Textbooks were strictly regulated by the government. Police spies were planted everywhere. Under Nicholas I, would-be revolutionaries were sent off to Siberia, with hundreds of thousands sent to Katorga camps. The retaliation for the revolt made December 14, a day long remembered by later revolutionary movements. The question of Russia's direction had been gaining attention ever since Peter the Great's program of modernization. Some favored imitating Western Europe while others were against this and called for a return to the traditions of the past. The latter path was advocated by Slavophiles, who held the decadent West in contempt. The Slavophiles were opponents of bureaucracy, who preferred the collectivism of the medieval Russian obchina or mir over the individualism of the West. More extreme social doctrines were elaborated by such Russian radicals on the left, such as Alexander Herzen, Mikhail Bakunin, and Peter Kropotkin. Foreign policy, 1800–1864. After Russian armies liberated the eastern Georgian kingdom, allied since the 1783 Treaty of Georgievsk, from the Khaja dynasty's occupation of 1802, during the Russo-Persian War, 1804–1813, they clashed with Persia over control and consolidation of Georgia, and also became involved in the Caucasian War against the Caucasian Imamate. At the conclusion of the war, Persia irrevocably ceded what is now Dagestan, eastern Georgia, and most of Azerbaijan to Russia, under the Treaty of Gulistan. Russia attempted to expand to the southwest, at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, using recently acquired Georgia at its base for its Caucasus and Anatolian front. The late 1820s were successful years militarily. Despite losing almost all recently consolidated territories in the first year of the Russo-Persian War of 1826–1828, Russia managed to bring an end to the war with highly favorable terms granted by the Treaty of Turkmenchay, including the formal acquisition of what are now Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Igdir province. In the 1828–1829 Russo-Turkish War, Russia invaded northeastern Anatolia and occupied the strategic Ottoman towns of Erzurum and Gümüşhane and, posing as protector and savior of the Greek Orthodox population, received extensive support from the region's Pontic Greeks. Following a brief occupation, the Russian Imperial Army withdrew back into Georgia. Russian emperors quelled two uprisings in their newly acquired Polish territories, the November Uprising in 1830 and the January Uprising in 1863. In 1863, the Russian autocracy had given the Polish artisans and gentry reason to rebel, by assailing national core values of language, religion, and culture. France, Britain, and Austria tried to intervene in the crisis but were unable to do so. The Russian press and state propaganda used the Polish uprising to justify the need for unity in the empire. The semi-autonomous polity of Congress Poland subsequently lost its distinctive political and judicial rights, with Russification being imposed on its schools and courts. However, Russification policies in Poland, Finland and among the Germans in the Baltics largely failed and only strengthened political opposition. Second half of the 19th century. In 1854–1855, Russia fought Britain, France and the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War, which Russia lost. The war was fought primarily in the Crimean Peninsula, and to a lesser extent in the Baltic during the related Aloud War. Since playing a major role in the defeat of Napoleon, Russia had been regarded as militarily invincible, but against a coalition of the great powers of Europe, the reverses it suffered on land and sea exposed the weakness of Emperor Nicholas I's regime. When Emperor Alexander II ascended the throne in 1855, the desire for reform was widespread. A growing humanitarian movement attacked serfdom as inefficient. In 1859, there were more than 23 million serfs in usually poor living conditions. Alexander II decided to abolish serfdom from above, with ample provision for the landowners, rather than wait for it to be abolished from below by revolution. The Emancipation Reform of 1861, which freed the serfs, was the single most important event in 19th-century Russian history, and the beginning of the end of the landed aristocracy's monopoly on power. The 1860s saw further socio-economic reforms to clarify the position of the Russian government with regard to property rights. Emancipation brought a supply of free labor to the cities, stimulating industry, and the middle class grew in number and influence. However, instead of receiving their lands as a gift, the freed peasants had to pay a special lifetime tax to the government, which in turn paid the landlords a generous price for the land that they had lost. In numerous cases, the peasants ended up with relatively small amounts of the least productive land. All the property turned over to the peasants was owned collectively by the mir, the village community, which divided the land among the peasants and supervised the various holdings. Although serfdom was abolished, since its abolition was achieved on terms unfavorable to the peasants, revolutionary tensions did not abate. Revolutionaries believed that the newly freed serfs were merely being sold into wage slavery in the onset of the Industrial Revolution, and that the urban bourgeoisie had effectively replaced the landowners. Seeking more territories, Russia obtained Primorye, Russian Manchuria, from the weakened Manchu-ruled King China, which was occupied fighting against the Taiping Rebellion. In 1858, the Treaty of Aigun ceded much of the Manchu homeland, and in 1860, the Treaty of Peking ceded the modern Primorsky Krai, also founded the outpost of future Vladivostok. Meanwhile, Russia decided to sell the indefensible Russian America to the United States for 11 million rubles, $7.2 million, in 1867. Initially, many Americans considered this newly gained territory to be a wasteland and useless, and saw the government wasting money, but later, much gold and petroleum were discovered. In the late 1870s, Russia and the Ottoman Empire again clashed in the Balkans. From 1875 to 1877, the Balkan crisis intensified, with rebellions against Ottoman rule by various Slavic nationalities, which the Ottoman Turks had dominated since the 15th century. This was seen as a political risk in Russia, which similarly suppressed its Muslims in Central Asia and Caucasia. Russian nationalist opinion became a major domestic factor with its support for liberating Balkan Christians from Ottoman rule and making Bulgaria and Serbia independent. In early 1877, Russia intervened on behalf of Serbian and Russian volunteer forces, leading to the Russo-Turkish War, 1877–78. Within 1 year, Russian troops were nearing Constantinople and the Ottomans surrendered. Russia's nationalist diplomats and generals persuaded Alexander II to force the Ottomans to sign the Treaty of San Stefano in March 1878, creating an enlarged, independent Bulgaria that stretched into the southwestern Balkans. When Britain threatened to declare war over the terms of the treaty, an exhausted Russia backed down. At the Congress of Berlin in July 1878, Russia agreed to the creation of a smaller Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia, as a vassal state and an autonomous principality inside the Ottoman Empire, respectively. As a result, pan-Slavists were left with a legacy of bitterness against Austria-Hungary and Germany for failing to back Russia. Disappointment at the results of the war stimulated revolutionary tensions, and helped Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro gain independence from, and strengthen themselves against, the Ottomans. Another significant result of the 1877–1878 Russo-Turkish War in Russia's favor was the acquisition from the Ottomans of the provinces of Batum, Ardahan, and Kars in Transcaucasia, which were transformed into the militarily administered regions of Batum Oblast and Kars Oblast. To replace Muslim refugees who had fled across the new frontier into Ottoman territory, the Russian authorities settled large numbers of Christians from ethnically diverse communities in Kars Oblast, particularly Georgians, Caucasus Greeks, and Armenians, each of whom hoped to achieve protection and advance their own regional ambitions. Alexander III. In 1881, Alexander II was assassinated by the Narodnaya Volya, a nihilist terrorist organization. The throne passed to Alexander III, 1881–1894, a reactionary who revived the maxim of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality of Nicholas I. A committed Slavophile, Alexander III believed that Russia could be saved from turmoil only by shutting itself off from the subversive influences of Western Europe. During his reign, Russia formed the Franco-Russian alliance to contain the growing power of Germany, completed the conquest of Central Asia, and demanded important territorial and commercial concessions from China. The emperor's most influential advisor was Konstantin Pobedonostsev, tutor to Alexander III and his son Nicholas, and procurator of the Holy Synod from 1880 to 1895. Pobedonostsev taught his imperial pupils to fear freedom of speech and the press, as well as dislike democracy, constitutions, and the parliamentary system. Under Pobedonostsev, revolutionaries were persecuted by the imperial secret police, with thousands being exiled to Siberia, and a policy of Russification was carried out throughout the empire. Foreign policy, 1864–1907. Russia had little difficulty expanding to the south, including conquering Turkestan, until Britain became alarmed when Russia threatened Afghanistan, with the implicit threat to India, and decades of diplomatic maneuvering resulted, called the Great Game. That rivalry between the two empires has been considered to have included far-flung territories such as Outer Mongolia and Tibet. The maneuvering largely ended with the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. Expansion into the vast stretches of Siberia was slow and expensive, but finally became possible with the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway, 1890–1904. This opened up East Asia, and Russian interests focused on Mongolia, Manchuria, and Korea. China was too weak to resist, and was pulled increasingly into the Russian sphere. Russia obtained treaty ports such as Dalian, Port Arthur. In 1900, the Russian Empire invaded Manchuria as part of the Eight-Nation Alliance's intervention against the Boxer Rebellion. Japan strongly opposed Russian expansion, and defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905. Japan took over Korea, and Manchuria remained a contested area. Meanwhile, France, looking for allies against Germany after 1871, formed a military alliance in 1894, with large-scale loans to Russia, sales of arms, and warships, as well as diplomatic support. Once Afghanistan was informally partitioned by the Anglo-Russian Convention in 1907, Britain, France, and Russia came increasingly close together in opposition to Germany and Austria-Hungary. The three would later comprise the Triple Entente alliance in the First World War. Early 20th century. In 1894, Alexander III was succeeded by his son, Nicholas II, who was committed to retaining the autocracy that his father had left him. Nicholas II proved as an ineffective ruler, and in the end his dynasty was overthrown by the Russian Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began to show significant influence in Russia, but the country remained rural and poor. Economic conditions steadily improved after 1890, thanks to new crops such as sugar beets, and new access to railway transportation. Total grain production increased, as well as exports, even with rising domestic demand from population growth. As a result, there was a slow improvement in the living standards of Russian peasants in the empire's last 2 decades before 1914. Recent research into the physical stature of army recruits shows they were bigger and stronger. There were regional variations, with more poverty in the heavily populated central Black Earth region, and there were temporary downturns in 1891–93 and 1905–1908. By the end of the 19th century, the Russian Empire dominated its territorial extent, covering a surface area of 22,800,000 square kilometers, making it become the world's third largest empire. On the political right, the reactionary elements of the aristocracy strongly favored the large landholders, who, however, were slowly selling their land to the peasants through the Peasants' Land Bank. The Octobrist Party was a conservative force, with a base of landowners and businessmen. They accepted land reform but insisted that property owners be fully paid. They favored far-reaching reforms, and hoped the landlord class would fade away, while agreeing they should be paid for their land. Liberal elements among industrial capitalists and nobility, who believed in peaceful social reform and a constitutional monarchy, formed the Constitutional Democratic Party or Cadets. On the left, the Socialist Revolutionaries, SRs, and the Marxist Social Democrats wanted to expropriate the land, without payment, but debated whether to distribute the land among the peasants, the Narodnik solution, or to put it into collective local ownership. The Socialist Revolutionaries also differed from the Social Democrats in that the SRs believed a revolution must rely on urban workers, not the peasantry. In 1903, at the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, in London, the party split into two wings, the gradualist Mensheviks and the more radical Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks believed that the Russian working class was insufficiently developed and that socialism could be achieved only after a period of bourgeois democratic rule. They thus tended to ally themselves with the forces of bourgeois liberalism. The Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin, supported the idea of forming a small elite of professional revolutionists, subject to strong party discipline, to act as the vanguard of the proletariat, in order to seize power by force. Defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–1905, was a major blow to the Tsarist regime and further increased the potential for unrest. In January 1905, an incident known as Bloody Sunday occurred when Father Georgy Gapon led an enormous crowd to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the emperor. When the procession reached the palace, soldiers opened fire on the crowd, killing hundreds. The Russian masses were so furious over the massacre that a general strike was declared, which demanded a democratic republic. This marked the beginning of the revolution of 1905. Soviets, councils of workers, appeared in most cities to direct revolutionary activity. Russia was paralyzed, and the government was desperate. In October 1905, Nicholas reluctantly issued the October Manifesto, which conceded the creation of a national Duma, legislature, to be called without delay. The right to vote was extended and no law was to become final without confirmation by the Duma. The moderate groups were satisfied, but the socialists rejected the concessions as insufficient and tried to organize new strikes. By the end of 1905, there was disunity among the reformers, and the emperor's position was strengthened, allowing him to roll back some of the concessions with the new Russian constitution of 1906. War, revolution, and collapse. Origins of causes. Russia, along with France and Britain, was a member of the Entente in antecedent to World War I. These three powers were formed up in response to Germany's rival Triple Alliance, comprising itself, Austria-Hungary and Italy. Previously, St. Petersburg and Paris, along with London, were belligerents in the Crimean War. The relations with Britain were in disquietude from the Great Game in Central Asia until the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention, when both agreed to settle their differences and joined to oppose the new rising power of Germany. Russia and France's relations remained isolated before the 1890s when both sides agreed to ally when peace was threatened. France also granted loans for building infrastructure, especially railways. The relations between Russia and the Triple Alliance, especially Germany and Austria, were like those of the League of the Three Emperors. Russia's relations with Germany were deteriorating, and tensions over the Eastern Question had reached a breaking point with Austria-Hungary. The 1908 Bosnian crisis had nearly led to war, and in 1912–13 relations between St. Petersburg and Vienna were tense during the Balkan Wars. The assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, raised Europe's tensions, which led to the confrontation between Austria and Russia. Serbia rejected an Austrian ultimatum that demanded an obligation for the heir's death, and Austria-Hungary cut all diplomatic ties and declared war on 28 July 1914. Russia supported Serbia because it was a fellow Slavic state, and 2 days later, Emperor Nicholas II ordered a mobilization to attempt to force Austria-Hungary to back down. Declaration of war. As a result of Vienna's declaration of war on Serbia, Nicholas II ordered the mobilization of 4.9 million men. Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally, saw the call to arms as a threat. When Russia mustered its troops, Germany affirmed the state of imminent danger of war, followed by the declaration of war on 1 August 1914. The Russians were imbued with patriotic earnestness and Germanophobic sentiment, including the name of the capital, St. Petersburg, which sounded too German for the sake of words Sankt and Berg, and was thus renamed to the Russianized Petrograd. The Russian entry into the First World War was followed by France, which both had been allied with Russia since 1892, fearing the rise of Germany as the new power. The German General Staff had therefore devised the Schlieffen Plan, which first eliminated France via non-aligned Belgium before moving east to attack Russia, whose massive army was much slower to mobilize. Theaters. German theater. By August 1914, Russia had invaded with unexpected speed the German province of East Prussia, ending with a humiliating defeat at Tannenberg, owing to a message sent without wiring and coding, causing the destruction of the entire Second Army. Russia suffered a massive defeat at the Masurian Lakes twice, the first ending with 100,000 casualties, and the second suffering 200,000. By October, the German Ninth Army was near Warsaw, and the newly formed 10th Army had retreated from the frontier in East Prussia. Grand Duke Nicholas, the Russian commander-in-chief, now had the order to invade Silesia with his 5th, 4th, and 9th Armies. The 9th Army, led by Mackensen, retreated from the front line in Galicia and concentrated between the cities of Posen and Thorn. The advance took place on the 11th of November against the main army's right flank and rear. The 1st and 2nd Armies were severely mauled, and the 2nd Army was nearly surrounded in Łódź on the 17th of November. Exhausted Russian troops began to withdraw from Russian-held Poland, allowing the Germans to capture many cities, including the kingdom's capital Warsaw on 5 August 1915. In the same month, the Emperor dismissed Grand Duke Nicholas and took personal command. This was a turning point for the Russian army and the beginning of the worst disaster. The Germans continued pushing the front until they were halted in the line from Riga to Tarnopol. Russia lost the entire territory of Poland and Lithuania, part of the Baltic states and Grodno, and partly of Volhynia and Podolia in Ukraine. Thereafter the front with Germany was stable until 1917. Austrian theater. Austria-Hungary went to war with Russia on 6 August. The Russians started to invade Galicia, held by Austrian Cisleithania on 20 August, and annihilated the Austro-Hungarian army at Lemberg, leading to the occupation of Galicia. While the fortress of Przemysl was besieged, the first attempt to capture the fortress failed, but the second attempt seized the redoubt in March 1915. On 2 May, the Russian army was broken through by joint Austro-German forces, retreating from the Gorlice to Tarnow line and losing Przemysl. On 4 June 1916, General Alexei Brusilov carried out an offensive by targeting Kovel. His offensive was a great success, taking 76,000 prisoners from the main attack and 1,500 from the Austrian bridgehead. But the offensive was halted by inadequate ammunition and the lack of supplies. The eponymous offensive was the most successful Allied strike of World War I, practically destroying the Austro-Hungarian army as an independent force, but the slaughter of many casualties, approximately 1 million men, forced the Russian forces not to rebuild or launch any further attacks. Turkish theater. On 29 October 1914, a prelude to the Russo-Turkish front. The Turkish fleet, with German support, began to raid Russian coastal cities in Odessa, Sevastopol, Novorossiysk, Feodosia, Kerch, and Yalta. This led Russia to declare war on the Ottoman Empire on the 2nd of November. The Russians, led by Baltic German General Georgy Bergmann, opened the front by crossing the frontier but failed to capture Kaprakoy. In December, Russia obtained success at Sarikamish, where the Russian general Nikolai Yudenich routed Enver Pasha. Problems in the empire. By the middle of 1915, the impact of the war was demoralizing. Food and fuel were in short supply, casualties were increasing, and inflation was mounting. Strikes rose among low-paid factory workers, and there were reports that peasants, who wanted reforms of land ownership, were restless. The emperor eventually decided to take personal command of the army and moved to the front, leaving his wife, the Empress Alexandra, in charge in the capital. She fell under the spell of a monk, Grigory Rasputin, 1869–1916. His assassination in late 1916 by a clique of nobles could not restore the emperor's lost prestige. End of imperial rule. On 3 March 1917, International Women's Day, a strike was organized at a factory in the capital, followed by thousands of people took to the streets in Petrograd to protest food shortages. A day later, protesters rose to 200,000, demanding that Russia withdraw from the war and the emperor be deposed. 80,000 Russian troops, half of the men sent to restore order, had gone on strike and refused the senior officers' orders. Any imperial symbols were destroyed and burned. The capital was out of control and gripped by protest and strife. In the city of Pskov, 262 kilometers, 163 miles, southwest from the capital, many generals and politicians advised the emperor to abdicate in favor of the Tsarevich. Nicholas accepted, but he bequeathed the throne to Grand Duke Michael as his legitimate successor. The Tsarist system was fully overthrown. After a series of deportations and imprisonments, in July 1918, the Romanov family was executed by the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg. Territory. By the end of the 19th century, the area of the empire was about 22,400,000 square kilometers, 8,600,000 square miles, or almost one-sixth of the Earth's landmass. Its only rival in size at the time was the British Empire. The majority of the population lived in European Russia. More than 100 different ethnic groups lived in the Russian Empire, with ethnic Russians composing about 45% of the population. Geography. The administrative boundaries of European Russia, apart from Finland and its portion of Poland, coincided approximately with the natural limits of the East European plains. To the north was the Arctic Ocean. Novaya Zemlya and the Kolowev and Vagic Islands were considered part of European Russia, but the Kara Sea was part of Siberia. To the east were the Asiatic territories of the empire, Siberia and the Kyrgyz steppes, from both of which it was separated by the Ural Mountains, the Ural River, and the Caspian Sea. The administrative boundary, however, partly extended into Asia on the Siberian slope of the Urals. To the south were the Black Sea and the Caucasus, being separated from the latter by the Manik River depression, which in post-Pliocene times connected the Sea of Azov with the Caspian. The western boundary was purely arbitrary. It crossed the Kola Peninsula from the Varangafjord to the Gulf of Bothnia. It then ran to the Curonian Lagoon in the southern Baltic Sea, and then to the mouth of the Danube, taking a great circular sweep to the west to embrace east-central Poland, and separating Russia from Prussia, Austrian Galicia, and Romania. An important feature of Russia is its few free outlets to the open sea, outside the icebound shores of the Arctic Ocean. The deep indentations of the Gulfs of Bothnia and Finland were surrounded by what is ethnically Finnish territory, and it is only at the very head of the latter gulf that the Russians had taken firm foothold by erecting their capital at the mouth of the Neva River. The Gulf of Riga and the Baltic belong also to territory that was not inhabited by Slavs, but by Baltic and Finnic peoples, and by Germans. The east coast of the Black Sea belonged to Transcaucasia, a great chain of mountains separating it from Russia. But even this sheet of water is an inland sea, the only outlet of which, the Bosphorus, was in foreign hands, while the Caspian Sea, an immense shallow lake, mostly bordered by deserts, possessed more importance as a link between Russia and its Asiatic settlements than as a channel for intercourse with other countries. Territorial development. From 1860 to 1905, the Russian Empire occupied all territories of the present-day Russian Federation, with the exception of the present-day Kaliningrad Oblast, Kuril Islands and Tuva. In 1905 Russia lost southern Sakhalin to Japan, but gained Tuva as a protectorate in 1914. Prior to 1917 the Russian Empire included most of Dnieper Ukraine, Belarus, Bessarabia, the Grand Duchy of Finland, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, the Central Asian states of Russian Turkestan, most of the Baltic governorates, a significant part of Poland, and the former Ottoman provinces of Ardahan, Artvan, Igdir, Kars, and the northeastern part of Erzurum province. Henry Kissinger noted that the methodological procedure how the Russian Empire started to expand their territory was incomparable to that of how the United States had done the same. Russian statesman Alexander Gorchakov justified the Russian expansion in consonance of the manifest destiny of the United States. Thereafter, the Russian territorial expansion only encountered nomadic or feudal societies, which is strikingly similar to the westward expansion of the United States. Between 1742 and 1867, the Russian-American Company administered Alaska as a colony. The company also established settlements in Hawaii, including Fort Elizabeth, 1817, and as far south in North America as Fort Ross Colony, established in 1812, in Sonoma County, California, just north of San Francisco. Both Fort Ross and the Russian River in California got their names from Russian settlers, who had staked claims in a region claimed until 1821 by the Spanish as part of New Spain. Following the Swedish defeat in the Finnish War of 1808–1809 and the signing of the Treaty of Frederikshamn on 17 September 1809, the eastern half of Sweden, the area that then became Finland, was incorporated into the Russian Empire as an autonomous Grand Duchy. The emperor eventually ended up ruling Finland as a semi-constitutional monarch through the Governor-General of Finland and a native senate appointed by him. The emperor never explicitly recognized Finland as a constitutional state in its own right, although his Finnish subjects came to consider the Grand Duchy as such. In the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, 1806–1812, and the ensuing Treaty of Bucharest, 1812, the eastern parts of the Principality of Moldavia, an Ottoman vassal state, along with some areas formerly under direct Ottoman rule, came under the rule of the empire. This area, Bessarabia, was among the Russian Empire's last territorial acquisitions in Europe. At the Congress of Vienna, 1815, Russia gained sovereignty over Congress Poland, which on paper was an autonomous kingdom in personal union with Russia. However, this autonomy was eroded after the November Uprising in 1831, and was finally abolished in 1867. St. Petersburg gradually extended and consolidated its control over the Caucasus in the course of the 19th century, at the expense of Persia through the Russo-Persian War, 1804–13, and Russo-Persian War, 1826–28, and the respectively ensuing treaties of Gulistan and Turkmenchay, as well as through the Caucasian War, 1817–1864. The Russian Empire expanded its influence and possessions in Central Asia, especially in the later 19th century, conquering much of Russian Turkestan in 1865 and continuing to add territory as late as 1885. Newly discovered Arctic islands became part of the Russian Empire. The new Siberian islands from the early 18th century, Severnaya Zemlya, Emperor Nicholas II land, first mapped and claimed as late as 1913. During World War I, Russia briefly occupied a small part of East Prussia, then a part of Germany, a significant portion of Austrian Galicia, and significant portions of Ottoman Armenia. While the modern Russian Federation currently controls the Kaliningrad Oblast, which comprised the northern part of East Prussia, this differs from the area captured by the Empire in 1914, though there was some overlap. Gusev, Gumbinnen in German, was the site of the initial Russian victory. Imperial territories. According to the first article of the Organic Law, the Russian Empire was one indivisible state. In addition, the 26th article stated that, with the Imperial Russian throne are indivisible the Kingdom of Poland and Grand Principality of Finland. Relations with the Grand Principality of Finland were also regulated by the second article. The Grand Principality of Finland constituted an indivisible part of the Russian state, in its internal affairs governed by special regulations at the base of special laws, and by the law of 10 June 1910. Between 1744 and 1867, the empire also controlled Russian America. With the exception of this territory, modern-day Alaska, the Russian Empire was a contiguous mass of land spanning Europe and Asia. In this it differed from contemporary colonial-style empires. The result of this was that, while the British and French empires declined in the 20th century, a large portion of the Russian Empire's territory remained together, first within the Soviet Union, and after 1991 in the smaller Russian Federation. Furthermore, the empire at times controlled concession territories, notably the Kwantung Leased Territory and the Chinese Eastern Railway, both conceded by King China, as well as the Russian concession of Tianjin. In 1815, Georg Anton Schaefer, a Russian entrepreneur, went to Kauai and negotiated a treaty of protection with the island's governor Kaumoali, vassal of King Kamehameha I of Hawaii, but the Russian emperor refused to ratify the treaty. See also Orthodox Church in Hawaii and Russian Fort Elizabeth. In 1889, a Russian adventurer, Nikolai Ivanovich Akhanov, tried to establish a Russian colony in Africa, Sagalo, situated on the Gulf of Tadjoura in present-day Djibouti. However, this attempt angered the French, who dispatched 2 gunboats against the colony. After a brief resistance, the colony surrendered and the Russian settlers were deported to Odessa. Government and administration. From its initial creation until the 1905 revolution, the Russian Empire was led by the emperor, also referred to as Tsar, who ruled as an absolute monarch. After the revolution of 1905, Russia developed a new type of government, which became difficult to categorize. In the Almanac de Gotha for 1910, Russia was described as a constitutional monarchy under an autocratic Tsar. This contradiction in terms demonstrated the difficulty of precisely defining the system, transitional and sui generis, established in the Russian Empire after October 1905. Before this date, the fundamental laws of Russia described the power of the emperor as autocratic and unlimited. After October 1905, while the imperial style was still emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, the fundamental laws were changed by removing the word unlimited. While the emperor retained many of his old prerogatives, including an absolute veto over all legislation, he equally agreed to the establishment of an elected parliament, without whose consent no laws were to be enacted in Russia. Not that the regime in Russia had become in any true sense constitutional, far less parliamentary. But the unlimited autocracy had given way to self-limited autocracy. Whether this autocracy was to be permanently limited by the new changes, or only at the continuing discretion of the autocrat, became a subject of heated controversy between conflicting parties in the state. Provisionally, then, the Russian governmental system may perhaps be best defined as a limited monarchy under an autocratic emperor. Conservatism was the ideology of most of the Russian leadership, albeit with some reformist activities from time to time. The structure of conservative thought was based upon anti-rationalism of the intellectuals, religiosity rooted in the Russian Orthodox Church, traditionalism rooted in the landed estates worked by serfs, and militarism rooted in the army officer corps. Regarding irrationality, Russia avoided the full force of the European Enlightenment, which gave priority to rationalism, preferring the romanticism of an idealized nation-state that reflected the beliefs, values, and behavior of the distinctive people. The distinctly liberal notion of progress was replaced by a conservative notion of modernization based on the incorporation of modern technology to serve the established system. The promise of modernization in the service of autocracy frightened the socialist intellectual Alexander Herzen, who warned of a Russia governed by Genghis Khan with a telegraph. Emperor. Peter the Great changed his title from Tsar to Emperor in order to secure Russia's position in the European state system. While later rulers did not discard the new title, the Russian monarch was commonly known as the Tsar or Tsaritsa until the imperial system was abolished during the February Revolution of 1917. Prior to the issuance of the October Manifesto, the emperor ruled as an absolute monarch, subject to only two limitations on his authority, both of which were intended to protect the existing system. The emperor and his consort must both belong to the Russian Orthodox Church, and he must obey the Pauline laws of succession established by Paul I. Beyond this, the power of the Russian autocrat was virtually limitless. On 17 October 1905, the situation changed. The ruler voluntarily limited his legislative power by decreeing that no measure was to become law without the consent of the Imperial Duma, a freely elected National Assembly established by the Organic Law issued on 28 April 1906. However, he retained the right to disband the newly established Duma, and he exercised this right more than once. He also retained an absolute veto over all legislation, and only he could initiate any changes to the organic law itself. His ministers were responsible solely to him, and not to the Duma or any other authority, which could question but not remove them. Thus, while the emperor's personal powers were limited in scope after 28 April 1906, they remained formidable. Imperial Council. Under Russia's revised fundamental law of 20 February 1906, the State Council was associated with the Duma as a legislative upper house. From this time the legislative power was exercised normally by the emperor only in concert with the two chambers. The Council of the Empire, or Imperial Council, as reconstituted for this purpose, consisted of 196 members, of whom 98 were nominated by the emperor, while 98 were elective. The ministers, also nominated, were ex officio members. Of the elected members, 3 were returned by the black clergy, the monks, 3 by the white clergy, secular, 18 by the corporations of nobles, 6 by the Academy of Sciences and the universities, 6 by the chambers of commerce, 6 by the industrial councils, 34 by local governmental zemstvos, 16 by local governments having no zemstvos, and 6 by Poland. As a legislative body, the powers of the council were coordinate with those of the Duma. In practice, however, it has seldom if ever initiated legislation. State Duma. The Duma of the Empire or Imperial Duma, Gosudarstvenaya Duma, which formed the lower house of the Russian parliament, consisted, since the UKAZ of 2 June 1907, of 442 members, elected by an exceedingly complicated process. The membership was manipulated as to secure an overwhelming majority of the wealthy, especially the landed classes, and also for the representatives of the Russian peoples at the expense of the subject nations. Each province of the empire, except Central Asia, returned a certain number of members, added to which were those returned by several large cities. The members of the Duma were chosen by electoral colleges, and these, in their turn, were elected by assemblies of the three classes: landed proprietors, citizens, and peasants. In these assemblies, the wealthiest proprietors sat in person while the lesser proprietors were represented by delegates. The urban population was divided into two categories according to taxable wealth and elected delegates directly to the College of the Governorates. The peasants were represented by delegates selected by the regional subdivisions called volosts. Workmen were treated in a special manner, with every industrial concern employing 50 hands electing one or more delegates to the electoral college. In the college itself, the voting for the Duma was by secret ballot and a simple majority carried the day. Since the majority consisted of conservative elements, the landowners and urban delegates, the progressives had little chance of representation at all, save for the curious provision that one member at least in each government was to be chosen from each of the 5 classes represented in the college. That the Duma had any radical elements was mainly due to the peculiar franchise enjoyed by the 7 largest towns: St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev, Odessa, Riga, and the Polish cities of Warsaw and Łódź. These elected their delegates to the Duma directly, and though their votes were divided, on the basis of taxable property, in such a way as to give the advantage to wealth. Each returned the same number of delegates. Council of Ministers. In 1905, a Council of Ministers, Soviet Ministrov, was created, under a minister-president, the first appearance of a prime minister in Russia. This council consisted of all the ministers and of the heads of other principal departments. The ministries were as follows: Ministry of the Imperial Court, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of War, Ministry of the Navy, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, created in 1905, Ministry of Internal Affairs, including Police, Health, Censorship and Press, Posts and Telegraphs, Foreign Religions, Statistics, Ministry of Agriculture and State Assets, Ministry of Ways of Communications, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of National Education. Most Holy Synod. The Most Holy Synod, established in 1721, was the supreme organ of government of the Orthodox Church in Russia. It was presided over by a lay procurator, representing the emperor, and consisted of the three metropolitans of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kiev, the Archbishop of Georgia, and a number of bishops sitting in rotation. Senate. The Senate, Pravitelствующий Senate, i.e. directing or governing Senate, originally established during the government reform of Peter the Great, consisted of members nominated by the emperor. Its wide variety of functions were carried out by the different departments into which it was divided. It was the Supreme Court of Cassation, an audit office, a high court of justice for all political offences, and one of its departments fulfilled the functions of a herald's college. It also had supreme jurisdiction in all disputes arising out of the administration of the empire, notably in differences between representatives of the central power and the elected organs of local self-government. Lastly, it promulgated new laws, a function which theoretically gave it a power akin to that of the Supreme Court of the United States, of rejecting measures not in accordance with fundamental laws. Administrative divisions. As of 1914, Russia was divided into 81 governorates, gubernias, 20 oblasts, and 1 okrug. Vassals and protectorates of the Russian Empire included the Emirate of Bukhara, the Khanate of Khiva, and, after 1914, Tuva, Urienkai. Of these, 11 governorates, 17 oblasts, and 1 okrug, Sakhalin, belonged to Asian Russia. Of the rest, 8 governorates were in Finland and 10 in Congress Poland. European Russia thus embraced 59 governorates and 1 oblast, that of the Don. The Don Oblast was under the direct jurisdiction of the Ministry of War. The rest each had a governor and deputy governor, the latter presiding over the administrative council. In addition, there were governors general, generally placed over several governorates and armed with more extensive powers, usually including the command of the troops within the limits of their jurisdiction. In 1906, there were governors general in Finland, Warsaw, Vilna, Kiev, Moscow, and Riga. The larger cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Odessa, Sevastopol, Kerch, Nikolaev, and Rostov, had administrative systems of their own, independent of the governorates. In these the chief of police acted as governor. Judicial system. The judicial system of the Russian Empire was established by the Statute of 20 November 1864 of Alexander II. This system, based partly on English and French law, was predicated on the separation of judicial and administrative functions, the independence of the judges and courts, public trials and oral procedure, and the equality of all classes before the law. Moreover, a democratic element was introduced by the adoption of the jury system and the election of judges. This system was disliked by the bureaucracy, due to its putting the administration of justice outside of the executive sphere. During the latter years of Alexander II and the reign of Alexander III, power that had been given was gradually taken back, and that take-back was fully reversed by the Third Duma after the 1905 revolution. The system established by the law of 1864 had 2 wholly separate tribunals, each having their own courts of appeal and coming in contact with each other only in the Senate, which acted as the Supreme Court of Cassation. The first tribunal, based on the English model, were the courts of the elected justices of the peace, with jurisdiction over petty causes, whether civil or criminal. The second, based on the French model, were the ordinary tribunals of nominated judges, sitting with or without a jury to hear important cases. Local administration. Alongside the local organs of the central government in Russia, there are three classes of local elected bodies charged with administrative functions: the peasant assemblies in the mirs and the volosts, the zemstvos in the 34 governorates of Russia, the Municipal Duma. Municipal Duma. Since 1870, the municipalities in European Russia had institutions like those of the zemstvos. All owners of houses, tax-paying merchants, artisans, and workmen were enrolled on lists, in descending order according to their assessed wealth. The total valuation was then divided into three equal parts, representing three groups of electors very unequal in number, each of which would elect an equal number of delegates to the Municipal Duma. The executive was in the hands of an elected mayor and an uprava, which consisted of several members elected by the Municipal Duma. Under Alexander III, however, by laws promulgated in 1892 and 1894, the Municipal Duma was subordinated to the governors in the same way as the zemstvos. In 1894, municipal institutions, with still more restricted powers, were granted to several towns in Siberia, and in 1895 to some in the Caucasus. Baltic provinces. The formerly Swedish-controlled Baltic provinces of Livonia and Estonia and later Duchy of Courland, a vassal of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, were incorporated into the Russian Empire after the defeat of Sweden in the Great Northern War. Under the Treaty of Nystad of 1721, the Baltic German nobility retained considerable powers of self-government and numerous privileges in matters affecting education, police, and the local administration of justice. After 167 years of German-language administration and education, in 1888 and 1889 laws were passed transferring administration of the police and manorial justice from Baltic German control to officials of the central government. About the same time, a process of Russification was being carried out in the same provinces, in all departments of administration, in the higher schools, and in the Imperial University of Dorpa, the name of which was altered to Yuriev. In 1893, district committees for the management of the peasants' affairs, similar to those in purely Russian governments, were introduced into this part of the empire. Economy. Before the liberation of the serfs in 1861, Russia's economy mainly depended on agriculture. By the census of 1897, 95% of the Russian population lived in the countryside. Nicholas I attempted to modernize his country, and have it not been so dependent on a single economic sector. During the reign of Alexander III, many reforms occurred. The Peasants' Land Bank was founded in 1883 to provide loans for Russian peasants, both as individuals and in communes. The Nobles' Land Bank, in 1885, made loans at nominal interest rates to the landed nobility. The poll tax was abolished in 1886. When Ivan Vyshnegradsky was appointed as the new Minister of Finance in 1886, he increased the pressure on peasants by increasing taxes on land and prescribing how they harvested grain. These policies led to the severe Russian famine of 1891 to 1892 that lasted from 1891 to 1892, with 400,000 perishing from starvation. Vyshnegradsky was succeeded by Count Sergei Witt in 1892. Witt began by raising revenues through a monopoly on alcohol, which brought in 300 million rubles 1894. These reforms returned the peasants to essentially being serfs again. In 1900, a peasant class, also known as kulak, had emerged, representing less than 20% of the population, who were characterized by owning some of their land, machinery, and livestock. An income tax was introduced in 1916. Agriculture. Russia had a long-standing economic bargain on fundamental agriculture on large estates, which was worked by Russian peasants, also known as serfs, who did not get any rights from slave masters under the system of barshchina. Another system was called obrok, in which serfs worked in exchange for cash or goods from the master, allowing them to work outside the estate. These systems were based on a legal code called the Sobernoye Eulogenie, which was introduced by Alexis I in 1649. From 1891 to 1892, peasants were faced with new policies carried out by Ivan Vyshnegradsky, causing a famine and disease that took the lives of 400,000 people, especially in the Volga region, eliciting the greatest decline in grain production. Mining and heavy industry. Infrastructure. Railways. After 1860, the planning and building of the railway network had far-reaching effects on the economy, culture, and ordinary life of Russia. The central authorities and the imperial elite made most of the key decisions, but local elites made demands for rail linkages. Local nobles, merchants, and entrepreneurs imagined a future of promoting their regional interests, from locality to empire. Often, they had to compete with other cities. By envisioning their own role in a rail network, they came to understand how important they were to the empire's economy. During the 1880s, the Russian army built two major railway lines in Central Asia. The Transcaucasus Railway connected the city of Batum on the Black Sea and the oil center of Baku on the Caspian Sea. The Trans-Caspian Railway began at Krasnovodsk on the Caspian Sea and reached Bukhara, Samarkand, and Tashkent. Both lines served the commercial and strategic needs of the empire and facilitated migration. Religion. The Russian Empire's state religion was Orthodox Christianity. The emperor was not allowed to profess any faith other than the Orthodox, Article 62 of the 1906 Fundamental Laws, and was deemed the supreme defender and guardian of the dogmas of the predominant faith and is the keeper of the purity of the faith and all good order within the Holy Church, Article 64 ex supra. Although he made and annulled all senior ecclesiastical appointments, he did not settle questions of dogma or church teaching. The principal ecclesiastical authority of the Russian Church, which extended its jurisdiction over the entire territory of the empire, including the ex-kingdom of Kartli-Kakheti, was the Most Holy Synod, the civilian over-procurator of the Holy Synod being one of the Council of Ministers with wide de facto powers in ecclesiastical matters. The ecclesiastical heads of the National Russian Orthodox Church consisted of 3 metropolitans, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev, 14 archbishops and 50 bishops, all drawn from the ranks of the monastic, celibate, clergy. The parochial clergy had to be married when appointed, but if left widowers were not allowed to marry again. This rule continues to apply today. Religious policy. All non-Orthodox religions were formally forbidden from proselytizing within the empire. In a policy influenced by Catherine II but solidified in the 19th century, Tsarist Russia exhibited increasing confessionalization, pursuing top-down reorganization of the empire's faiths, also referred to as the confessional state. The Tsarist administration sought to arrange orthodoxies within Islam, Buddhism, and the Protestant faiths, which was performed by creating spiritual assemblies, in the case of Islam, Judaism, and Lutheranism, banning and declaring bishoprics, in the case of Roman Catholicism, and arbitrating doctrinal disputes. When the state lacked resources to provide a secular bureaucracy across its entire territory, guided reformation of faiths provided elements of social control. Anti-Semitism. After Catherine II annexed eastern Poland in the Polish partitions, there were restrictions placed against Jews known as the Pale of Settlement, an area of Tsarist Russia inside which Jews were authorized to settle, and outside of which were deprived of various rights such as freedom of movement or commerce. Particularly repressive was Emperor Nicholas I, who sought the forced assimilation of Jews. From 1827 conscripted Jewish children as cantonists in military institutions in the East aiming to compel them to convert to Christianity, attempted to stratify Jews into useful and not useful based on wealth and further restricted religious and commercial rights within the Pale of Settlement. Emperor Alexander II ceased this harsh treatment and pursued a more bureaucratic type of assimilation, such as compensating the cantonists for their previous military service, including those who remained Jewish, although certain military ranks were still limited to Christians. In contrast, Emperor Alexander III resumed an atmosphere of oppression, including the May Laws, which further restricted Jewish settlements and rights to own property, as well as limiting the types of professions available, and the expulsion of Jews from Kiev in 1886 and Moscow in 1891. The overall anti-Jewish policy of the Russian Empire led to significant sustained emigration. Persecution of Muslims. Islam had a sheltered but precarious place in the Russian Empire. Initially, sporadic forced conversions were demanded against Muslims in the early Russian Empire. In the 18th century, Catherine II issued an edict of toleration that gave legal status to Islam and allowed Muslims to fulfill religious obligations. Catherine also established the Orenburg Muslim Spiritual Assembly, which had a degree of imperial jurisdiction over the organization of Islamic practice in the country. As the Russian Empire expanded, Tsarist administrators found it expedient to draw on existing Islamic religious institutions that were already in place. In the 19th century, the restrictive policies became much more oppressive during the Russo-Turkish Wars, and the Russian Empire perpetrated persecutions such as the Circassian genocide during the 1860s. Following its conquest of Circassia, around 1 to 1.5 million Circassians, almost half of the total population, were killed or forcibly deported. Many of those who fled persecution also died en route to other countries. Today, the vast majority of Circassians live in diaspora communities. Throughout the late 19th century, the term Circassian became a common adage for highwaymen across the Balkan and Anatolian regions, due to the prevalence of homeless Circassian refugees. Many groups of Muslims such as Crimean Tatars were forced to emigrate to the Ottoman Empire following the Russian defeat in the Crimean War. During the latter portion of the 19th century, the status of Islam in the Russian Empire became associated with the Tsarist regime's ideological principles of official nationality requiring Russian orthodoxy. Nonetheless, in certain areas Islamic institutions were allowed to operate, such as the Orenburg Assembly, but were designated with a lower status. Policy towards non-Eastern Orthodox Christian sects. Despite the predominance of orthodoxy, several Christian denominations were professed. Lutherans were particularly tolerated with the invited settlement of Volga Germans and the presence of Baltic German nobility. During the reign of Catherine II, the Jesuit suppression was not promulgated, so Jesuits survived in Russian Empire, and this Russian society played a role in re-establishing the Jesuits in the West. Overall, Roman Catholicism was strictly controlled during Catherine II's reign, which was considered an epoch of relative tolerance for Catholicism. Catholics were distrusted by the Russian Empire as elements of Polish nationalism, a perception which especially increased following the January uprising. After this Russification policies intensified and Orthodox churches such as Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, Warsaw were built across Congress Poland, but no forced conversion was attempted. Tsarist religious policy was focused on punishing Orthodox dissenters, such as uniates and sectarians. Old believers were seen as dangerous elements and persecuted heavily. Various minor sects such as Spiritual Christians and Molokan were banished in internal exile to Transcaucasia and Central Asia, with some further emigrating to the Americas. Duhobas came to settle primarily in Canada. In 1905, Emperor Nicholas II issued a religious toleration edict that gave legal status to non-Orthodox religions. This created a «golden age of old faith» for the previously persecuted Old Believers until the emergence of the Soviet Union. In the early 20th century, some of the restrictions of the Pale of Settlement were reversed, though were not formally abolished until the February Revolution. However, some historians evaluate Tsar Nicholas II as having given tacit approval to the anti-Semitic pogroms that resulted from reactionary riots. Edward Radzinsky suggested that many pogroms were incited by authorities and supported by the Tsarist Russian secret police, the Okhrana, even if some happened spontaneously. According to Radzinsky, Sergei Witt, appointed Prime Minister in 1905, remarked in his memoirs that he found that some proclamations inciting pogroms were printed and distributed by Imperial Police. 69. Demography. Imperial Census of 1897. According to returns published in 1905, Based on the Russian Empire census of 1897, adherents of the different religious communities in the empire numbered approximately as follows. Russian Central Asia. Russian Central Asia was also called Turkestan. As of the 1897 census, Russian Central Asia's 5 oblasts contained 5,260,300 inhabitants, 13.9% of them urban. The largest towns were Tashkent, 156,400, Kokand, 82,100, Namangan, 61,900, and Samarkand, 54,900. By 1911, 17% of Semirech's population and half of its urban residents were Russians, 4/5 of them agricultural colonists. In the other 4 oblasts in the same year, Russians constituted only 4% of the population, and the overwhelming majority lived in European-style settlements alongside the native quarters in the major towns. Military. The military of the Russian Empire consisted of the Imperial Russian Army and the Imperial Russian Navy. Its poor performance during the Crimean War of 1853–56 caused great soul-searching and resulted in proposals for reform. However, the Russian forces fell further behind the technology, training, and organization of the German, French, and particularly the British militaries. The army performed poorly in World War I and became a center of unrest and revolutionary activity. The events of the February Revolution and the fierce political struggles inside army units led to irreversible disintegration. Society. The Russian Empire was predominantly a rural society spread over vast spaces. In 1913, 80% of the people were peasants. Soviet historiography proclaimed that the Russian Empire of the 19th century was characterized by systemic crisis, which impoverished the workers and peasants and culminated in the revolutions of the early 20th century. Recent research by Russian scholars disputes this interpretation. Mironov assesses the effects of the reforms of latter 19th century, especially in terms of the 1861 emancipation of the serfs, agricultural output trends, various standard of living indicators, and taxation of peasants. He argues that those reforms brought about measurable improvements in social welfare. More generally, he finds that the well-being of the Russian people declined during most of the 18th century but increased slowly from the end of the 18th century to 1914. Estates. Subjects of the Russian Empire were segregated into soslovies, or social estates, classes, such as nobility, dvorinstvo, clergy, merchants, Cossacks, and peasants. Native people of the Caucasus, non-ethnic Russian areas such as Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Siberia, and Central Asia were officially registered as a category called inorodtsi, non-Slavic, literally, people of another origin. A majority of the population, 81.6%, belonged to the peasant order. The other classes were the nobility, 0.6%, clergy, 0.1%, the burghers and merchants, 9.3%, and military, 6.1%. More than 88 million Russians were peasants, some of whom were former serfs, 10,447,149 males in 1858. The remainder being state peasants, 9,194,891 males in 1858, exclusive of the Archangel Governorate, and domain peasants, 842,740 males the same year. Intelligentsia. Raznochentsy, Zemlyachestvo. Serfdom. The serfdom that had developed in Russia in the 16th century, and had become enshrined in law in 1649, was abolished in 1861. Household servants or dependents attached to personal service were merely set free, while the landed peasants received their houses and orchards, and allotments of arable land. These allotments were given over to the rural commune, the mir, which was responsible for the payment of taxes for the allotments. For these allotments the peasants had to pay a fixed rent, which could be fulfilled by personal labor. The allotments could be redeemed by peasants with the help of the crown, and then they were freed from all obligations to the landlord. The crown paid the landlord and the peasants had to repay the crown, for 49 years at 6% interest. The financial redemption to the landlord was not calculated on the value of the allotments but was considered as compensation for the loss of the compulsory labor of the serfs. Many proprietors contrived to curtail the allotments that the peasants had occupied under serfdom, and frequently deprived them of precisely that land of which they were most in need, pasture lands around their houses. The result was to compel the peasants to rent land from their former masters. Serfs lived in deplorable conditions, working in the fields for nearly 7 days a week and being exiled to the harsh land of Siberia or sent to military service. Owners had the right to sell slaves, depending on whether they were targeting land or accused, i.e., had escaped from working. Children of serfs received less education. These serfs were heavily taxed, making them the poorest in any Russians. In 1861, Emperor Alexander II saw serfs as a problem that held back Russia's development, so he liberated 23 million serfs to become free, but they remained indigent throughout the former enslaved population despite their rights. The zemstvo system was introduced in 1865 as a rural assembly with administrative authority over the local population, including education and welfare, which ex-serfs were unable to acquire. Free agriculturalist. State serf. Peasants. The former serfs became peasants, joining the millions of farmers who already had peasant status. Most peasants lived in tens of thousands of small villages under a highly patriarchal system. Hundreds of thousands moved to cities to work in factories, but they typically retained their village connections. After emancipation reform, 1/4 of peasants received allotments of only 1.2 hectares, 2.9 acres, per male, and 1/2 received less than 3.4 to 4.6 hectares, 8.5 to 11.4 acres, the normal size of the allotment necessary for the subsistence of a family under the three-field system is estimated at 11 to 17 hectares, 28 to 42 acres. This land was of necessity rented from the landlords. The aggregate value of the redemption and land taxes often reached 185 to 275% of the normal rental value of the allotments, not to speak of taxes for recruiting purposes, the church, roads, local administration, and so on, chiefly levied on the peasants. This burden increased every year. Consequently, 1/5 of the inhabitants left their houses and cattle disappeared. Every year more than half the adult males, in some districts 3/4 of the men and 1/3 of the women, quit their homes and wandered throughout Russia in search of work. In the governments of the Black Earth area the state of matters was hardly better. Many peasants took gratuitous allotments, whose amount was about 1/8 of the normal allotments. The average allotment in Kherson was only 0.36 hectares, 0.90 acres, and for allotments from 1.2 to 2.3 hectares, 2.9 to 5.8 acres, the peasants paid 5 to 10 rubles in redemption tax. The state peasants were better off, but they, too, were emigrating in masses. It was only in the steppe that the situation was more hopeful. In Ukraine, where the allotments were personal, the mere existing only among state peasants, the state of affairs was not better, on account of high redemption taxes. In the western provinces, where the land was more cheaply valued and the allotments somewhat increased after the Polish insurrection, the situation was better. Finally, in the Baltic provinces nearly all the land belonged to the German landlords, who either farmed the land themselves, with hired laborers, or let it in small farms. Only 1/4 of the peasants were farmers, the remainder were mere laborers. Landowners. The situation of the former serf proprietors was also unsatisfactory. Accustomed to the use of compulsory labor, they failed to adapt to the new conditions. The millions of rubles of redemption money received from the crown was spent without any real or lasting agricultural improvements having been effected. The forests were sold, and the only prosperous landlords were those who exacted rack rents for the land allotted to peasants. There was an increase of wealth among the few, but along with this a general impoverishment of the mass of the people. Added to this, the peculiar institution of the mir, framed on the principle of community ownership and occupation of the land, the overall effect was not encouraging of individual effort, During the years 1861 to 1892, the land owned by the nobles decreased 30%, or from 850,000 to 610,000 kilometers to 210 million to 150 million acres. During the following 4 years, an additional 8,577 kilometers to 2,119,500 acres was sold, and since then the sales went on at an accelerated rate, until in 1903 alone close to 8,000 kilometers to 2 million acres passed out of their hands. On the other hand, since 1861, and more especially since 1882, when the Peasant Land Bank was founded for making advances to peasants who were desirous of purchasing land, the former serfs, or rather their descendants, had between 1883 and 1904 bought about 78,900 kilometers to 19,500,000 acres from their former masters. In November 1906, however, Emperor Nicholas II promulgated a provisional order permitting the peasants to become freeholders of allotments made at the time of emancipation, all redemption dues being remitted. This measure, which was endorsed by the Third Duma in an act passed on 21 December 1908, was calculated to have far-reaching and profound effects on the rural economy of Russia. 13 years previously, the government had endeavored to secure greater fixity and permanence of tenure by providing that at least 12 years must elapse between every 2 redistributions of the land belonging to a mir amongst those entitled to share in it. The order of November 1906 provided that the various strips of land held by each peasant should be merged into a single holding. The Duma, however, on the advice of the government, left its implementation to the future, regarding it as an ideal that could only gradually be realized. Media censorship was heavy-handed until the reign of Alexander II, but it never went away. Newspapers were strictly limited in what they could publish, and intellectuals favored literary magazines for their publishing outlets. Fyodor Dostoevsky, for example, ridiculed the St. Petersburg newspapers, such as Golos and Peterburgsky Listok, which he accused of publishing trifles and distracting readers from the pressing social concerns of contemporary Russia through their obsession with spectacle and European popular culture. Education. Educational standards were very low in the Russian Empire, though they slowly increased in its last century of existence. By 1800, the level of literacy among male peasants ranged from 1 to 12% and from 20 to 25% for urban men. Literacy among women was very low. Literacy rates were highest for the nobility, 84 to 87%, merchants, over 75%, then the workers and peasants. Serfs were the least literate. In every group, women were far less literate than men. By contrast, in Western Europe, urban men had about a 50% literacy rate. The Orthodox hierarchy was suspicious of education, seeing no religious need for literacy whatsoever. Peasants did not need to be literate, and those who did, such as artisans, businessmen, and professionals, were few in number. As late as 1851, only 8% of Russians lived in cities. The accession in 1801 of Alexander I, 1801 to 1825, was widely welcomed as an opening to fresh liberal ideas from the European Enlightenment. Many reforms were promised, but few were actually carried out before 1820, when the emperor turned his attention to foreign affairs and personal religion and ignored reform issues. In sharp contrast to Western Europe, the entire empire had a very small bureaucracy, about 17,000 public officials, most of whom lived in 2 of the largest cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. Modernization of government required much larger numbers, but that, in turn, required an educational system that could provide suitable training. Russia lacked that, and for university education, young men went to Western Europe. The army and the church had their own training programs, narrowly focused on their particular needs. The most important successful reform under Alexander I was the creation of a national system of education. The Ministry of Education was established in 1802, and the country was divided into 6 educational regions. The long-term plan was for a university in every region, a secondary school in every major city, upgraded primary schools, and, serving the largest number of students, a parish school for every 2 parishes. By 1825, the national government operated 6 universities, 48 secondary state schools, and 337 improved primary schools. Highly qualified teachers arrived from France, fleeing the revolution there. Exiled Jesuits set up elite boarding schools until their order was expelled in 1815. At the highest level, universities were based on the German model, in Kazan, Kharkov. St. Petersburg, Vilna, refounded as the Imperial University in 1803, and Dorpa, while the relatively young Imperial Moscow University was expanded. The higher forms of education were reserved for a very small elite, with only a few hundred students at the universities by 1825 and 5,500 in the secondary schools. There were no schools open to girls. Most rich families still depended on private tutors. Emperor Nicholas I was a reactionary who wanted to neutralize foreign ideas, especially those he ridiculed as pseudo-knowledge. Nevertheless, his Minister of Education, Sergei Uvarov, at the university level promoted more academic freedom for the faculty, who were under suspicion by reactionary church officials. Uvarov raised academic standards, improved facilities, and opened the admission doors a bit wider. Nicholas tolerated Uvarov's achievements until 1848, then reversed his innovations. For the rest of the century, the national government continued to focus on universities, and generally ignored elementary and secondary educational needs. By 1900 there were 17,000 university students, and over 30,000 were enrolled in specialized technical institutes. The students were conspicuous in Moscow and St. Petersburg as a political force typically at the forefront of demonstrations and disturbances. The majority of tertiary institutions in the empire used Russian, while some used other languages but later underwent Russification. Other educational institutions in the empire included the Nersian School in Tiflis.